Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The SNP government ordered an urgent review on how double rapist Isla Bryson, formerly Adam Graham, was allowed into a women's prison. The review was due to be delivered to prison chiefs on Friday, but we've heard nothing further about it. The case of this double rapist has been a huge scandal, but the public are in the dark about exactly what happened and who was involved. So will the First Minister publish the urgent review in full today?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, before I turn to answer Douglas Ross's question, can I take the opportunity to express my sympathy with the people of Turkey and Syria following the devastating earthquake earlier this week? The suffering and loss of life will be felt for generations. We're committed to doing all we can to help. Members of our emergency services have already been deployed to help the search and rescue operation on the ground. Yesterday we confirmed a £500,000 contribution to the Disasters Emergency Committee appeal. I know that all parties will help promote that appeal following First Minister's questions, and anybody who wishes and is able to do so can do so at www.dec.org.uk. Presiding Officer, turning to the question on the review that has been referred to, the SPS provided a final report to the Cabinet Secretary for Justice on the 8th of February. The Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service met the Justice Secretary in the course of a regular meeting schedule yesterday to discuss that. The Cabinet Secretary has already confirmed he will update the Criminal Justice Committee this week, and both the Cabinet Secretary and the SPS Chief Executive are due to attend the Justice Committee later in February, where of course members of this Parliament will be able to ask questions. So there will be full transparency about the findings of that review, as is right and proper.
Douglas Ross.
Could I associate myself with the remarks of the First Minister? And she's correct, all party leaders and MSPs will join in solidarity after FMQs to support the DEC Scotland appeal, and I welcome the funding provided by the Scottish Government and I believe the significant match funding by the UK Government on all donations received to help and support those who have been terribly affected in Turkey and Syria. So again, we're in this situation. I asked the First Minister a very direct question and I don't get an answer. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice had this report yesterday. The First Minister spoke about further discussions with the Justice Committee, but failed to commit to publishing the report in full. Will she now do that? Will the First Minister confirm that her government will publish the report in full? It's on the Justice Secretary's desk. I assume she has seen it. The public deserve to see it, because there are still so many unanswered questions. At the last count, the First Minister had refused 12 times to say if Isla Bryson is a man or a woman. And it's important because that affects how public bodies treat these criminals when they are released from jail. The First Minister says she doesn't have enough information to decide if this double rapist is a man. He's a rapist. He has a penis. What further information can the First Minister possibly need? So can I ask her, when this monster comes out of jail, will Nicola Sturgeon, I'm sorry, if SNP members are grumbling at me calling a double rapist a monster, you should look at yourselves. Because I'm asking, when he comes out of jail, will Nicola Sturgeon and her government consider him a man or a woman?
First Minister.
Firstly, on the report, Presiding Officer, I really do think Douglas Ross is clutching at straws in his follow-up question. I made very clear the findings of the report will be published. The Cabinet Secretary confirmed, I believe he confirmed in this chamber, that he will update the Criminal Justice Committee this week. Parliament rises today, of course, for this week, and both the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service, Theresa Medhurst, will actually attend the Justice Committee on the 22nd of February, following the week's recess of Parliament, and members of that committee will be able to ask questions about that review. So I'm not sure how anybody can suggest that there is not going to be full transparency around that review, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to set that out again for Mr Ross. On the subsequent part of his question. The individual we're talking about here identifies as a woman. However, it is really important, I think, to very calmly set out that any rights associated with that are not a result of any legislation passed by this Parliament, and indeed wouldn't be the result of that legislation even if it were in force. It's a result of the Equality Act passed by the UK Parliament, reserved to the UK Parliament in 2004, which is effectively, and always has effectively, been based on self-identification. However, what it doesn't do is give any individual an automatic right to be treated in a certain way in the prison estate. And actually, this case demonstrates that, because the individual is in a male prison. What is relevant here, and why I have focused on this, is the crime and the nature of the risk posed. In this case, the individual is a double rapist, and in terms of decisions about how they are dealt with in the prison estate, that is the relevant factor. And finally, Presiding Officer, in any group, individuals, small minority of individuals, will commit crimes. In no other circumstances do we accept the stigmatisation and the denial of rights to the whole group, and we shouldn't do that here either.
So to go back to the first point about this report, the First Minister claims I'm clutching at straws on this. It seems that she's clutching onto this report because she's not willing to issue it in full today. The report findings, we are told, will be published at some point. Why not today? Why not publish the findings and the full report that your Justice Secretary has had for over 24 hours? And for the 13th time now, Nicola Sturgeon has been unable to say if Isla Bryson is a man or a woman, and she says it doesn't matter because it's how they're dealt with on the prison estate. But my question was very specifically about how they're dealt with when they leave prison. And the First Minister has tied herself up in knots over this issue, unable to answer that basic question, because she can't admit the truth. Her government is going to consider this double rapist a woman. Nicola Sturgeon has brought in a policy that states everybody who claims to be a woman must be considered a woman, even if they're a dishonest sex offender with a history of violence. So Isla Bryson will be considered a woman by this government, and that's why the First Minister is refusing to answer questions about this double rapist. So let me ask her about another offender, serving time right now. Not a rapist, but a dangerous criminal with a history of brutal violence. Tiffany Scott, formerly known as Andrew Burns, claims to be a woman. Does the First Minister believe this criminal is a woman?
First Minister.
I think Douglas Ross is demonstrating here a lack of understanding in the law. Any rights that any individual identifying as a woman have flow not from any decisions of this government or any decisions of this Parliament. They flow from the protected characteristic provisions in the 2004 Equality Act, which is UK-wide legislation and is and has always been based on self-identification. A gender recognition certificate, and of course the law passed by this Parliament is not yet in force, but a gender recognition certificate simply enables somebody to change their birth certificate. It does not give trans people any additional rights, and that is important. And in terms of how individuals are treated within the prison service, as I have said, that is based on the nature of the crime and the nature of the risk posed. And both of the cases, of course, that Douglas Ross has cited today demonstrate that in terms of the prisons that these individuals are in. And in terms of how prisoners are treated when they leave prison, for sex offenders, of course, there are well-established procedures, including the MAPA procedures. And again, they are based on an assessment of the nature of risk. So these are important issues. They are sensitive issues, not least for the trans community. As I said last week and I've said before, the overwhelming majority of whom only want to go on with living their lives and never commit any offences of any nature. But I don't think Douglas Ross does any service to anybody in the way that he approaches this. I'm struck by something his predecessor, as Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson has said. Trying to do gotcha questions about who is a woman, who is a man, I'm not sure helps, particularly for people in the trans community who are looking at the way this is reported. So perhaps Douglas Ross could take some guidance from his predecessor on this matter, and that might serve this whole debate better than the way he is doing right now.
Douglas Ross. Thank you.
This is not a gotcha question. It's a very basic... I'm sorry, there's dissent from the SNP. It's a very basic question. It's not just me. It's journalists who are asking this repeatedly to the First Minister. And I wouldn't stand up here asking these questions if at any point in the 13 previous attempts I'd ever got a straight answer from Nicola Sturgeon. So maybe don't focus on the question, focus on the deficiency of the answer. The fact that Nicola Sturgeon, now on two criminals who she said I've raised two different cases, they're very different cases. But the similarity is the First Minister's point-blank refusal to give an answer. And I think she has to look at that. And the First Minister accused me of basic misunderstanding of legislation. I'd have to say she's guilty of either basic or deliberate misunderstanding of her own policy. Because it's quite clear Tiffany Scott, this dangerous criminal, is treated as a woman in a man's jail. We've spoken to a former prison officer who told us this. All officers dealing with this individual were ordered to refer to Tiffany Scott as she and threatened with disciplinary measures if we didn't. They said that Scott, and this is quoting them, has used gender recognition as a tool to create as much chaos as possible within the prison system. And they continued, this is a classic example of devious, dangerous individuals who are exploiting this ridiculous situation. The words of a retired prison officer who has dealt with this person. We also know that female prison officers have been ordered to carry out intimate strip searches of Tiffany Scott. Reports quote officers who say nothing else about Scott has changed physically, and the officers say their rights have gone out of the window. So does the First Minister agree with me that this is completely unacceptable? And will she intervene today to stop women prison officers being forced to strip search the likes of Tiffany Scott?
First Minister.
Let me take these issues in turn. Firstly, and let me reiterate this, the law that this Parliament passed before Christmas, backed by two-thirds of MSPs across this chamber, including members of Douglas Ross's own party, is not yet in force. It wouldn't have the impact Douglas Ross says even if it was in force, but it's not in force. So by definition, it can't have that impact. The policies of this government, on these issues are guided by the Equality Act. I think I said earlier on 2004, of course the Equality Act is 2010, but they are guided by the Equality Act, governed by the Equality Act, which is a UK-wide piece of legislation. And the rights and protections that trans people have flow from that legislation, and that is important to set out. Those in the prison estate are dealt with depending on the nature of the crime and the nature of the risk posed. And again, it's important, I think, for reasons of public assurance, to underline that as well. And that is demonstrated by the two cases that have been cited in the media in recent days and here again today. And when it comes to searches in the prison estate, Firstly, the Scottish Prison Service, of course, has been dealing with transgender prisoners, although they are very, very small in number, for many, many years now. They have been doing it safely and effectively. They are experienced in managing these situations. But, of course, it's also the case that the SPS have the ability to use technology to search individuals without the need for any physical search to be conducted by officers. The SPS has a trauma-informed approach to the management of those in custody and an approach that supports staff as well as inmates in their care. So the SPS is experienced in these matters. I trust their handling of these matters, and it's important that we continue to ensure that they are handled appropriately. And that's what the Government, in association with the Scottish Prison Service, will continue to do.
Thank you. Question.